You'll forgive me if the lighting is a little bit dark. It's because I want to ensure that the PowerPoint is seen, and if I overbrighten it, the PowerPoint will be missed. This talk is entitled, Whose Land Is It Anyway? And it's a talk I actually first gave quite a while ago, and I've slightly updated since. But I want to look at the theology of the land and the history of the land, and perhaps draw some conclusions about where we are now in terms of Israel and Palestine. We begin with the Abrahamic Covenant. Around 2100 BC, in Genesis, God spoke to Abraham on a number of different occasions, and each time he chose to reveal a little more of his purposes for Abraham and his descendants. Genesis 12, 1-3 tells us that God said, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you, and I'll make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great. And so you will be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." And in this statement, which is the opening covenant with Abraham, there are four aspects to it. Firstly, there's the aspect of the land. It's specific to a geographical piece of land in the Middle East, and this is known as the Palestinian Covenant. Secondly, it infers a relationship with God which is unique and special. Thirdly, it speaks about seed, descendants from Abraham, who would also inherit the blessing. And then fourthly, the blessing itself, which is fulfilled for Abraham with the literal physical land, but also is fulfilled spiritually in the new covenant, so that all the families of the earth will be blessed. And all four aspects of the Abrahamic covenant are unconditional with respect to Abraham. And see also Genesis 13, 14-17, 15, 5-8, 17-21, and then chapter 22, 15-18. Now Genesis 15, 18-21 tells us that the land is given to Abraham and his descendants from the river of Egypt all the way to the Euphrates, and the people of the land are given into his hands. In Genesis 17, 1-8, God establishes a covenant of circumcision with Abraham, and we're told that he will be multiplied exceedingly. He'll be the father of a multitude of nations. God will make nations and kings come out of Abraham, and this covenant is an everlasting covenant, and God will give the land to them, and listen to this, as an everlasting possession. In Genesis 22:15, God gives further detail concerning this covenant. God will multiply his seed as the stars of the heavens and as the sand which is on the seashore, and his seed will possess the gates of their enemies. In Genesis 26, 23-24, and 28, 13-15, and 35, 9-12, the promises are confirmed to Isaac and Jacob respectively. And here we have the land that was promised to them. However, what we need to understand also is that this is a conditional covenant with respect to the descendants of Abraham. Now hear, O Israel, says Deuteronomy 4 verse 1, listen to the statutes and judgments which I am teaching you to perform, so that you may live and go in and take possession of the land which the Lord your God is, the God of your fathers, is giving you. But then in Genesis 28, God lays out the terms of that covenant. The blessings which come upon Israel are promised to Abraham and are conditional upon obedience to the law. The curses are also a result of disobedience to the law and result in a removal from the land. In verse 63, it shall come about that as the Lord delighted over you to prosper you and multiply you, so the Lord will delight over you to make you perish and destroy you. And you will be torn from the land you are entering to possess it. Moreover, the Lord will scatter you among all peoples, from one end of the earth to the other end of the earth, and there you shall serve other gods, wood and stone, which you and your fathers have not known. And among those nations you shall find no rest, and there will be no resting place for the sole of your feet. But there the Lord will give you a trembling heart, failing of eyes, and despair of soul. And such has been the history of Israel. Obedience to the covenant has resulted in blessing and possession of the land. Disobedience results in disinheritance and removal from the land. Now there are 5 paradoxes of this covenant. Firstly, the covenant is conditional and unconditional. It's eternal. God will never break the covenant with Israel, but the receipt of the benefits of Israel, of the covenant, of the blessings on Israel, is conditional. Even though they've lived for the last 2,000 years without those benefits, the covenant is still in place, and God has begun to reignite the covenant once more through their restoration to the land. Secondly, it is both physical and spiritual. The physical aspects include seed and land, and are specific to the house of Israel. The spiritual aspects include friendship with God and blessing to all nations. The covenant will be fulfilled in both ways. He's brought them back to the land physically before he restores them to himself spiritually. Thirdly, it's national and it's international. It involves the physical nation of Israel, but it's also that through which the blessing in the form of salvation through Jesus is brought to the whole world. Fourthly, it's partial and total. Not all Jews will reap the benefit of the covenant. Romans 9 talks about not all descended from Israel are Israel, and we as non-Jews are beneficiaries of the covenant, of the spiritual blessings of the covenant with Abraham. And then fifthly, it's both temporal and eternal. It has a place on earth, but it's not necessarily everlasting. But the covenant is God's covenant with Israel and with his people who will be blessed is an eternal covenant. So let's go through the ancient history of the land from Abraham through to Rome. For about 200 years, Abraham and his descendants lived as sojourners in the land, moving from place to place as requirements to feed and water their flock led them. And with the coming of the famine at the time of Joseph, the whole family moved to Egypt, where they lived for about 400 years. The Exodus took place around 1446 BC, and after 40 years in the wilderness, the nation came to the edge of the land where Moses and Aaron both died. And so that brings us to Joshua and to the taking of possession of the land. The people were ordered, within the instructions of God, to destroy the inhabitants of the land. And this seems barbaric to us. So why were they asked to do this? Well, I'll give you 3 reasons, but there are more that could be contemplated. Firstly, the people of the land were irredeemable. Secondly, they had polluted the land. Leviticus 18:25 states, "For the land has become defiled, therefore I have brought its punishment upon it, so the land has spewed out its inhabitants." And then Exodus 23:31 to 33 says, "I will fix your boundary from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, and from the wilderness of the Euphrates River. For I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you will drive them out before you. You shall make no covenant with them or with their gods. They shall not live in your land, because they will make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you." So we have those 3 reasons given. Firstly, that these people were irredeemable. God had given them a chance to repent by Abraham and the others living amongst them. They had polluted the land by their actions, and we know that child sacrifice was part of the worship of the gods that they worshipped. And then thirdly, that because God wanted a purified people in the land. There's more to discuss on this, of course, and we could spend the whole session just talking about the justification of this genocide. But if you want to follow it more, read Krish Kandiah's book, Paradoxology. So what would be the consequences of not driving out the inhabitants of the land? Well, Numbers 55 to 56 includes these. "But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall come about that those whom you let remain of them will become pricks in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and they will trouble you in the land in which you live. And as I plan to do to them, so I will do to you." And of course, this is what we see played out in the book of Judges forward. Failure to deal with the inhabitants of the land resulted in harassment of the Hebrews, just as God promised in Deuteronomy. And that brings us to Samuel, Kings and Chronicles. which begins 1100 BC and goes through to around 605 BC. And this is the time of the kingdom. And during this time, we see David finally fulfilling the injunction given to Moses and Solomon and enjoying all the blessings promised to Abraham. Unfortunately, the rot set in as Solomon didn't do what the people were instructed to do. In fact, he did the opposite. He was seduced into worshipping other gods. And the consequences of this were that the kingdom was divided. The enemies began to come in from all sides, and the next 300 years were typified by a continuing slide into idolatry, interspersed with prophetic injunctions to repent, and with a few revival movements along the way, such as with Josiah in 620 BC. The northern kingdom was extorted, invaded, conquered, and finally taken captive, primarily by the Neo-Assyrian monarchs Tiglath-Pileser III and Shalmaneser V. The later Assyrian rulers Sargon II and his son and successor Sennacherib were responsible for finishing the 20-year demise of Israel's northern 10-king tribe kingdom. Sennacherib also invaded some parts of the southern kingdom of Judah, and he records 46 fortified towns captured from Judah and presumably carried away into Assyria. Jerusalem was besieged, and we read about that in 2 Kings, but it was not taken. The captivities began in approximately 740 BC when the tribes of Reuben, Gad and the eastern half-tribe of Manasseh were carried away by one of the first successful Assyrian invasions, and that's 1 Chronicles 5:26 and 2 Kings 15:29. In 722 BC, nearly 20 years after the first deportations, the ruling city of the northern kingdom of Israel, Samaria, was taken captive, finally taken by Sargon II after a 3-year siege, which was started by Shalmaneser V, and that's recorded in 2 Kings 17:3-6 and 2 Kings 18:11-12. And there's no record of those 10 tribes ever returning to the land, although the Samaritans are, of course, descended from the northern tribes who were left behind, who intermarried with people from other nations. Then we have the Babylonian captivity, or the Babylonian exile. And this is the name given to the deportation and exile of the Jews of the ancient kingdom of Judah to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar II between 605 and 586 BC. The exile to Babylon was a traumatic event in Jewish history, as the destruction of the political independence of the kingdom coincided with the destruction of the monarchy and of the first temple of Jerusalem. After the overthrow of Babylonia by the Persian Empire in 537 BC, the Persian ruler Cyrus the Great gave Jews permission to return to their homeland, and more than 40,000 are said to have returned, as noted in the biblical accounts of Ezra and Nehemiah, and also see Haggai and Zechariah. After the Babylonian captivity, there were always sizable numbers of Jews living outside Israel, thus marking one starting point of the Jewish diaspora. The land has only belonged to and been ruled over by the Jews since that time for a short period, from 140 BC until 37 BC. And then that didn't change until 1947. Between 537 BC and 333 BC, the land was ruled over by the Medo-Persians, but after the Battle of Issus, in November 333 BC, the land was then ruled over by Greeks. In 167 BC, the Jews revolted against their Greek overlords under Judas Maccabeus, and after 20 years of fighting, they finally established an independent Jewish state under Judas' brother Simon. And this was the establishment of the Hasmonean dynasty, which is recorded for us in the Apocrypha and Josephus. In 63 BC, Judea became a protectorate of Rome, coming under the administration of a governor, and Judea was allowed a king. The governor's business was to regulate trade and maximize tax revenue. And so in 37 BC, Herod married Mariamne, the daughter of the last Hasmonean king, and became king of Judah, even though he was actually an Edomite. And so that's the setting that we have in New Testament times. And Judah itself, the area of Judah, rather than Galilee and other parts, was ruled over directly by the Romans. Around AD 66, the Jews revolted again against Roman rule, as the governor Florus removed 17 talents of silver from the temple treasury. The revolt was put down harshly, and that began a siege of Jerusalem by the Romans in the year 70 AD, and this was a decisive event in the First Jewish-Roman War. It was followed by the fall of Masada in 73 AD, and the Roman army, led by the future Emperor Vespasian and his son Titus, besieged and conquered the city of Jerusalem, which had been occupied by its Jewish defenders in 66 AD, and the city and its famous temple were completely destroyed, and the Jews were largely scattered. And the scattering of the Jews resulted in a land lying fallow for the next 1900 years. And whilst it remained under the authority of Rome, it was not populated by one people, but by a collection of people. There were the Jews, the Philistines. The Greek name for this whole area was Palestine, first mentioned by Herodotus in the 5th century BC. This name was only rejected by Zionists at the beginning of the 20th century. Then there were also the Samaritans, and then there were Arabic nomadic tribes. And so the title Palestinian can cover any of the above who are not Jews. And during this time, those living in the land were Christians, Jews, and pagans. Then, around 571 AD, Muhammad was born in Mecca. And in 619 AD, he had a vision of a night journey to Jerusalem and from thence to heaven. And he saw himself carried on a winged horse to the Temple Mount, where the Al-Aqsa Mosque now stands. And from there he was led by Gabriel into heaven, where he met other prophets such as Abraham, Musa, Moses, and Isa, Jesus, and where he led prayer to God. And because of this event, Jerusalem became a holy place for Islam. And for this reason, Muslims used to pray in the direction of Jerusalem. This, of course, was later changed to Mecca when they fell out with the Jews in Saudi Arabia. Following a series of revelations in which he received the Quran directly as the spoken word of God, he moved to Medina, where he gained a following, and after a series of battles, he returned to Mecca and conquered it. He united the warring tribes and clans of Arabia under the banner of Islam. And the next few hundred years comprised a series of Islamic conquests in which the Arabic armies conquered North Africa, Spain, Sicily, the Middle East, as far as India and China and Asia Minor. By the 11th century, Palestine was ruled over by two factions. So, there we have all those things. And at the bottom we have the maps which showed the original Roman Empire, and then it's being reduced by the conquests of the Arab armies, finally leaving this small area. But all of this area was then, including Spain and Sicily, was then ruled over by the Muslims. And there were in two factions: the Fatimids, or Arabs, who ruled over Egypt, a bit to the south, this area here. And then there were the Turks, who had come from Turkestan in the north and conquering at the beginning of the 11th century and ruled over Asia Minor, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and then later on into what is now Turkey, and got as far as the gates of Vienna. The Turks were not united, but were constantly fighting one another, and their move into Asia Minor was the last straw for the Byzantine Emperor Alexius I Komnenos, who had been ruling this area from Constantinople, following the establishment of the eastern half of the empire by Emperor Constantine in 330 BC. And despite the division between the eastern and western halves of the empire and the church, he asked the West to help drive out the Turks out of Asia Minor, with the guise of opening up the road again for pilgrims to go to the Holy Land. On the 27th of November 1095, Pope Urban II preached a sermon at Claremont, which was a call to arms for Western knighthood. Urban's sermon proved incredibly effective as he summoned the attending nobility of Europe and the people to wrestle the Holy Lands from the hands of the Seljuk Turks. And this is what he said: I, or rather the Lord, beseech you as Christ's heralds to publish this everywhere and to persuade all people of whatever rank, foot soldiers and knights, poor and rich, to carry aid promptly to those Christians and to destroy that vile race from the lands of our friends. I say this to those who are present. It's meant also for those who are absent. Moreover, Christ commands it. And the promise for all who went on the Crusades was that their sins, no matter how bad, would be forgiven, and they would be assured of a place in heaven. And from Claremont, Pope Urban II went all over Western Europe preaching the same sermon and calling for knights to take up the cross, the red cross attached to their garments. In 1096, the first Crusaders set out, and after immense hardship, loss of life through disease, battle and hunger, they retook Jerusalem on the 15th of July 1099, slaughtering most of the inhabitants of the city as they did so, whether those inhabitants were Jews, Muslims or Christians. And on the way to Jerusalem there had already been a number of slaughterings of the Jews in Germany and Eastern Europe. In the following century, Crusaders set up a Christian kingdom in the Middle East, with areas ruled from Antioch, Tripoli and Edessa. Those are the Christian kingdoms that were set up in the Middle East at that time, the Crusader states. And in the centuries that followed, each of these kingdoms fell back into Muslim hands. Jerusalem fell to Saladin in July 1187, and at the height of his power, the Ayyubid dynasty he founded ruled over Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Hejaz and Yemen. You cannot understand the politics of the Middle East without some understanding of the influence of the Crusades upon it. This whole area was held by the Turks until the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire. For us Westerners, the Crusades are barely remembered, and if they are, we think of them as some kind of romantic adventure where chivalrous knights like Richard I performed brave exploits in far-off lands. For the Arabs, the Turks, etc., the Crusades represent a war with the West which is still going on. When George W. Bush in 2002 declared that in the war on terror the West was launching a new crusade, in Arab minds, this just confirmed what they still believed, that the West wants to make war with them in order to steal away their territory and butcher them. All Al-Qaeda rhetoric has included some reference to the Crusades. And the West's interference with Israel, or in Israel, is part of this and will always be looked on with suspicion by Arab nations. So that was the Ottoman Empire when it reached its full level up until 1683, and then it withdrew a little bit over the following centuries. Now let's look at the recent history of the land. In the latter part of the 19th century, following persecution in Eastern Europe, Jews began to drift back to the land. Ownership of the land was still in Turkish hands. The First World War, however, changed that, as under the leadership of T.E. Lawrence, the Arab tribes, in conjunction with the British, were united in a rebellion against the Turks and drove them out of Palestine. On the 9th of December 1917, Jerusalem fell into British hands. On entering Jerusalem, General Allenby is alleged to have said, "Today the Crusades have ended." And this is the Balfour Declaration that was made in November 1917 by a British government officer to Lord Rothschild, who was the president of the British Zionist Federation. "I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's Government the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, and which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's Government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by the Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Yours sincerely, Arthur James Balfour." One of the main proponents of a Jewish homeland in Palestine was Dr. Chaim Weizmann, the leading spokesman for organised Zionism in Britain. Weizmann was a chemist who had developed a process to synthesize acetone via fermentation. Acetone is required for the production of cordite, a powerful propellant explosive needed to fire ammunition without generating telltale smoke. Germany had cornered supplies of calcium acetate, a major source of acetone. Other pre-war processes in Britain were inadequate to meet the increased demand in World War I, and a shortage of cordite would have severely hampered Britain's war effort. Lloyd George, then Minister for Munitions, was grateful to Weizmann and so supported his Zionist aspirations. Another reason given by historians for this declaration was to bring America into the war. A favourable declaration would encourage American Jews to put pressure on their government to enter the war, and there was genuine fear that America would come into the war on the side of the Germans. The Balfour Declaration was ratified by the League of Nations in 1920 in Article 22 of the League Covenant. Palestine and Transjordan remained a single administrative unit until 1946, but in 1922 the League of Nations gave Britain administrative responsibility for the area referred to in the Balfour Declaration, and this was the area that was covered and agreed upon by the United Nations that would become the League of Nations that would later incorporate the Jewish state. Transjordan, this area on this side, was detached from the area to which Balfour Declaration applied, and this has remained a grievance with the Zionist side, but it should be remembered that the area to the east of the River Jordan was definitely included in the area promised to Hussein in 1915. The linking of Palestine and Transjordan had been an administrative convenience for Britain and did not indicate any recognition of Zionist claims to the east bank of the Jordan. And at this time, Britain detached all of that area east of the Jordan River from Palestine and gave it to the Hashemi family as an independent Arabic state. They are the ones who have become the kings of Jordan. Many historians believe that this was a sop to the Hashemites who had lost Syria to the French and Saudi Arabia to the Ibn Saud. As noted above, others believe that Transjordan was never part of Palestine. During this period between 1922 and 1947, this whole area, this on the left, was ruled over by the British. And the British mandate caused greater Jewish migration to Palestine and massive Jewish land purchases from feudal lords, which created landlessness and fueled unrest, often led by the same landlords who sold the land. And there were riots in 1920, 21, 29, sometimes accompanied by massacres of Jews. The victims were usually local, non-Zionist Orthodox Jewish communities. But Britain supported immigration in principle, but in reaction to Arab violence imposed restrictions on Jewish immigration. In 1933, Hitler came to power in Germany, and in 1935, the Nuremberg laws made German Jews and later Austrian and Czech Jews stateless refugees. Similar rules were applied by Nazi allies in Europe, and the subsequent growth in Jewish migration and impact of Nazi propaganda aimed at the Arab world led to the 1936 to 1939 Arab revolt in Palestine. Britain established the Peel Commission to investigate the situation, and the Commission did not consider the situation of Jews in Europe but called for a two-state solution and compulsory transfer of populations. But Britain rejected this solution and instead implemented the White Paper of 1939, and this planned to end Jewish immigration by 1944 and to allow no more than 35,000 further Jewish migrants. And the British maintained this policy until the end of the mandate and turned away during the war years shiploads of Jews who were fleeing from Germany and Eastern Europe during the war. After World War II and the Holocaust, Jews, especially Holocaust survivors, universally supported the Jewish community in Palestine. Zionist groups attacked the British in Palestine because of their restrictions on Jewish immigration, and eventually Britain was forced to refer the issue to the newly created United Nations. In 1947, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine recommended that Western Palestine should be partitioned into a Jewish state and an Arab state, and the UN-controlled territory around Jerusalem. And this partition was adopted on the 29th of November 1947 with UNGA Resolution 181, 33 votes in favour, 13 against and 10 abstentions, including Britain. And the vote led to celebrations in the streets of Jewish cities. This is the area that was mandated. The yellow areas were to be Arabic, the orange areas were to be Jewish, and the area around Jerusalem was to be the UN-controlled area. When the area was finally actually given over to with partition, this is how it came out, which is not dissimilar, but you'll see that there are some changes slightly in the map that's gone on there. The Palestinian Arabs and Arab states rejected the UN decision, demanding a single state and the removal of all Jewish migrants. The British mandate over Palestine officially terminated at midnight on the 14th of May 1948. Earlier in the day at 4 p.m, David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the creation of the State of Israel and became its first Prime Minister. Long-time advocate of Zionism in Britain, Chaim Weizmann, became Israel's first president. On May the 15th, the United States recognized the State of Israel, and the Soviet Union would soon follow suit. But the same day, the armies of 7 Arab countries invaded Israel, and the conflict led to an exodus of about 711,000 Arab Palestinians and the exodus of 850,000 Jews from the Arab world, mostly to Israel. It's known that on the days running up to the declaration of the State of Israel, the Grand Mufti of the area went around telling all Palestinians to leave the land because they were going to obliterate the State of Israel the moment it was announced. The conflict, Israel's War of Independence, was concluded by armistice agreements between Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon and Syria in 1949 and resulted in 50% increase in the Israeli territory. Between 1950 and 1956, 1,335 Israelis were killed by acts of terror by Palestinian groups, 1,000 of whom were civilians, and there were 12,000 acts of sabotage. In 1956, the French, British and Israeli forces engaged Egypt in response to its nationalisation of the Suez Canal and blockade of the Straits of Tiran, the Suez and the ports of Israel. Israeli forces took Sinai, but withdrew in March 1957 after the United Nations established the UN Emergency Force in the Gaza Strip and Sinai. And this war resulted in no territorial shifts and was followed by several years of terrorist incidents and retaliatory acts across Israel's border. In June 1967, Israeli forces struck again. They took out targets in Egypt, Jordan and Syria in response to the fact that Egypt was massing troops on its borders, and the fact that Nasser had ordered the withdrawal of any UN peacekeepers from the area. And the movement of Egyptian forces went on into the Sinai, so they were preparing another war against Israel. But after 6 days, all parties agreed to a ceasefire, under which Israel can retain control of the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, and the formerly Jordanian-controlled West Bank of the River Jordan and East Jerusalem. On November the 22nd, 1967, the Security Council adopted Resolution 242, the Land for Peace formula, which called for the establishment of a just and lasting peace based on Israeli withdrawal from territories occupied in 1967, in return for the end of all states of belligerency, respect for the sovereignty of all states in the area, and the right to live in peace within secure, recognised boundaries. So, effectively, at the end of the 67 war, Israel had taken these territories, the territory of Sinai, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank area, including East Jerusalem. The following years were marked by continuing violence across the Suez Canal, punctuated by the 69 to 70 War of Attrition. In October the 6th, 1973, the Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement, the armies of Syria and Egypt launched another attack against Israel. Although the Egyptians and Syrians initially made significant advances, Israel were able to push the invading armies back beyond the 1967 ceasefire lines, by the time the United States and Soviet Union helped bring an end to the fighting. In the UN Security Council, the United States supported Resolution 338, which reaffirmed Resolution 242 as the framework for peace and called for peace negotiations between the parties. In the years that followed, sporadic clashes continued along the ceasefire lines, but guided by the US, Egypt and Israel continued negotiations. In November 1977, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat made a historic visit to Jerusalem, which opened the door for the 1978 Israeli-Egyptian Peace Summit, convened at Camp David by President Carter. And these negotiations led to a 1979 peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, pursuant to which Israel withdrew from the Sinai in 1982, and it was signed by President Sadat of Egypt and the Prime Minister Menachem Begin of Israel. And that ceasefire between Israel and Egypt has been in place ever since. This brings us to Lebanon, the northern border. In the years following the 1948 war, Israel's border with Lebanon was quiet relative to its borders with other neighbours. After the expulsion of Palestinian fighters from Jordan in 1970 and their influx into southern Lebanon, however, hostilities along Israel's northern border increased, and Israeli forces crossed into Lebanon. After passage of Security Council Resolution 425 calling for Israeli withdrawal and the creation of a UN interim force in Lebanon, a peacekeeping force, Israel withdrew its troops. In June 1982, following a series of cross-border terrorist attacks and the attempted assassination of the Israeli ambassador to the UK, Israel invaded Lebanon again to fight the forces of Yasser Arafat's Palestinian Liberation Organization. The PLO withdrew its forces from Lebanon in August 1982. Israel, having failed to finalise an agreement with Lebanon, withdrew most of its troops in June 1985, save for a residual force which remained in southern Lebanon to act as a buffer against attacks in northern Israel. These remaining forces were completely withdrawn in May 2000 behind a UN-brokered delineation of the Israel-Lebanon border, known as the Blue Line. Hezbollah forces in southern Lebanon continue to attack Israeli positions, just as we've seen in the last few weeks, and attack the positions south of the Blue Line in the Sheba Farms and Hardov area of the Golan Heights. Since 1991, the victory of the US-led coalition in the Persian Gulf War in 1991 opened up new possibilities for regional peace. In October 1991, the United States and the Soviet Union convened the Madrid Conference, in which Israeli, Lebanese, Jordanian, Syrian, Palestinian leaders laid the foundations for ongoing negotiations designed to bring peace and economic development to the region. Within this framework, Israel and the PLO signed a Declaration of Principles on September 13, 1993, which established an ambitious set of objectives relating to a transfer of authority from Israel to interim Palestinian Authority. Israel and the PLO subsequently signed the Gaza-Jericho Agreement on the 4th of May 1994, and the Agreement on Preparatory Transfer of Powers and Responsibilities on 29th of August 1994, which began the process of transferring authority from Israel to the Palestinians, the so-called two-state solution. In the years since then, Israel has given over the areas of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank to Palestinian control. But this has led to violence between the two Palestinian parties, Fatah and Hamas. Fatah rule over the West Bank territory, this area, and of course Hamas over Gaza. In June 2007, Hamas effectively orchestrated a violent coup in Gaza, And Hamas also launched scores of Qassam rockets into southern Israel and have continued to do so ever since in an attempt to involve Israel in the Hamas-Fatah conflict, provoking the response of Israel over the last few years. And in the last 20 years, Hamas have fired tens of thousands of rockets and mortars randomly into southern Israel. Certainly, I believe we as a nation would not sit back under such circumstances without a response. But the issue at stake is whether the response by Israel has been proportionate. And that's another question that needs to be answered. However, since Hamas placed its rocket launchers and weapons in UN buildings, schools, mosques and hospitals, and in densely populated areas, it's not surprising that there have been high numbers of civilian casualties. They've sacrificed their civilian lives in order to increase international pressure on Israel to succeed to their demands for statehood. And in fact, they've gone further this time and have declared that what they want is the destruction of Israel completely. And so that makes it difficult to compare the response of Israel to the actions of Hamas. Let's now focus on what are called the occupied territories, this area of the West Bank and of Gaza. The United Nations Security Council in Resolution 446, Resolution 465 and Resolution 484, among others, the high contracting parties in the Fourth Geneva Convention and the International Committee of the Red Cross have each resolved that the territories discussed in this presentation are occupied. That's how they're declared by those bodies. And that the Fourth Geneva Convention provisions regarding occupied territories apply. In its advisory opinion on the separation barrier, the International Court of Justice described the West Bank, Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem as occupied, though without considering arguments for or against the applicability of that term. The government of Israel, in its public statements, and many of Israel's citizens and supporters dispute that the territories are occupied and claim that the use of the term occupied in relation to Israel's control of the areas has no basis in international law or history, and that it prejudices the outcome of any future or ongoing negotiations. They argue it's more accurate to refer to the territories as disputed rather than occupied, although they agree to apply the humanitarian provisions of the Fourth Geneva Convention, pending resolution of this dispute. Nevertheless, some Israeli government websites do refer to the areas as being occupied territories. However, in recent decades, the government of Israel has argued before the Supreme Court of Israel that its authority in the territories is based on the international law of belligerent occupation, in particular the Hague Convention of 1907, Articles 42 and 43. The court has confirmed this interpretation many times, for example in its 2004 and 2005 rulings on the separation fence and wall that later followed. According to the BBC, Israel argues that the international conventions relating to occupied land do not apply to the Palestinian territories because they were not under legitimate sovereignty of any state in the first place. In other words, Israel couldn't occupy them because no one ruled over them. Because the land was not under an existing government's control, it cannot be said to be occupied. Thus, Israel argues as long as there are hostilities towards them, they have the right of occupation. So let's come to issues of justice and the Palestinian question. Sometimes we seem to have the notion, perhaps because of media portrayal, that all Palestinians are terrorists. This is not true. They are a collection of peoples, mainly Arab, who have been resident in the land for a long time. Many of them are angry and feel let down by the international community. Imagine how you would feel if the United Nations decided it wanted to repatriate the ancient British people of the world, in other words the Welsh, the Bretons, the Celts, and to give them back the homeland that they once occupied, i.e. England, even though they had not lived there or ruled there for 2,000 years, and they were given control and government of the land. As an Englishman, I would be pretty angry and may well end up wanting to fight both the UN and the new settlers. And this is effectively what has been done to the previous occupants of Palestine. The international community did not make provision for them when giving Israel a homeland, and so they are a people, or more accurately a set of peoples, without a land or government, unless they want to leave and become part of the surrounding nations, or unless they want to come under the government of Israel. The law, the Mosaic law, provides that sojourners or strangers who dwell within the borders of Israel should be treated justly and fairly, Numbers 15:14. But this Israel has not really done. As the state of Israel established itself, many Palestinians were driven off their land and were never compensated. They ended up in the refugee camps in Gaza, etc., and these have become breeding grounds for terrorists due to their injustice. Unlike Arab citizens of Israel, the Arabs of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip do not have citizenship and are not afforded the same political rights and freedoms or protections under Israeli law as Israeli citizens who live in the same areas. This includes restraints on freedom of movement and no right to vote in Israel. Residents of East Jerusalem who were there for the census taking at the time of the Israeli annexation were granted permanent residency and the option to become Israeli citizens. Most refused for political reasons, and some say due to intimidation. According to B'Tselem, they are treated as immigrants who live in their homes at the beneficence of the authorities and not by right. Residents of the Golan Heights are permanent residents of Israel and can get Israeli citizenship. So while Israel are on the defensive, the treatment of residents as second-class citizens has tended to inflame rather than calm the situation, and this has provided more terrorists to the Palestinian cause. So what's the solution? The international community sees only one answer, and that is the two-state solution, where the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are given complete independence from Israel. On the one hand, we could argue that this is tantamount to giving away the land, which is theirs by right, according to the promises given to Abraham. On the other hand, we could argue that this land was not given to Israel in the 1948 settlement and therefore would not impinge on their rights. Returning to Israel's argument concerning belligerent occupation, as long as the Arab nations surrounding Israel refuse to accept the statehood of Israel and remain at enmity with Israel, the right of occupation is justifiable under international law, particularly since giving away these territories would make Israel indefensible. However, this does not solve the Palestinian question, and it's almost impossible to solve the question. What about the relationships over the years between Christians and Jews? The early church was completely Jewish and Samaritan, until Acts 10 and the house of Cornelius. Of course, the church was persecuted by the Jewish authorities, but actually it was just a Jewish sect up until that point. The biggest question of the New Testament was, can Gentiles become Christians without becoming Jewish? As more Gentiles came into the church, it split from Judaism and became an illegal, persecuted religion. Of course, in AD 312, Constantine converted to Christianity. He was about to lead his army in battle, a battle that would change the world, and the soldiers of his enemy Maxentius faced him at the Milvian Bridge outside Rome, and the winner would become the Roman emperor. Constantine was a pagan who worshipped the sun, and he was worried about the coming battle, and he says he started to pray to the supreme God for help, and there was a sign in the sky above the sun, and with it the words, "Conquer by this." And that night in a dream he saw Jesus telling him to use the Cairo, the X and the P, as safeguards in all battles. And Constantine ordered it to be put on his soldier's shield and won the battle of Milvian Bridge. And the symbol is the X and the P make up the first two letters of Christ's name, Cairo in Greek. And so as a result of this, Christianity became the state religion. And of course the result was that the world came into the church. And a theology concerning the Jews started to develop out of the scriptures, which referred to the Jews being responsible for Jesus' crucifixion, meaning, of course, the Jewish authorities. The truth is that only a few Jews were responsible, and it was actually Gentiles who put Jesus on the cross. And church fathers and writers began to write into this idea of the Jews being the murderers of Christ as Justin Martyr referred to it in the 2nd century. These were good men, but they had a warped theology of the Jewish nation. Gregory of Nyssa in the 4th century said this: "Murderers of the Lord and prophets, enemies of God and his laws, enemies of grace and of the faith of their fathers, advocates of the devil, a race of vipers, slanderers, scoffers, people whose spirits are in darkness, the leaven of the Pharisees, a congregation of demons, sinners, stoners, malicious beings who hate justice." St. John Chrysostom in the 4th century wrote this: "Since the deicide, in other words the murder of God, the Jews have been delivered into the hands of demons. They are fit only to be butchered. Their behaviour is not better than swine and oxen in their gross lewdness. The synagogue is a brothel, a cave of brigands, a den of ferocious animals." Cyril, Bishop of Alexandria in the 5th century, expelled all Jews from his city. Tertullian charged the Jews with the murder of God. St. Jerome in the 4th century charged the Jews with the murder of God. St. Augustine said this: "Jews are greedy people, incessantly occupied with material pleasures, a worldly people who have trampled Jesus underfoot, and they were doomed to disgrace." He accused Jews of crowning Jesus with thorns, spitting on him and piercing his flesh, all things that Gentiles actually did. Bernard of Clairvaux said of the Jews, "They are children of Satan." St. Thomas Aquinas said, "They can't cleanse themselves of his blood." And Martin Luther in the 16th century, the last sermon he preached was against the Jews, pleading that Germany would be rid of all Jews. We've taken the cry, "His blood be upon us and our children," as a reason for their punishment, and perhaps it's the reason they have been banished from the land for 2,000 years. But then we too have added to that punishment through persecutions, slaughterings, robbery, and murder in every way possible. In 315 AD, every convert to Judaism would be punished with civil action. In 339 AD, Jews and Christians were forbidden from marrying. In 325 AD, at the Nicene Council, they deliberately set out to de-Judaize Christianity by changing the dates of the celebrations of the major festivals. Hence, Easter is no longer on the same day as Passover. In 397 AD, the right of asylum in churches was denied to Jews. In 438 AD, the death penalty was introduced for anyone converting to Judaism. In 634 AD, Jews were forced to be baptized by law, or else they would be expelled from the empire, and this was later changed to execution. In 599 AD, Spain began a path of torture which climaxed in the Inquisition. We've already touched on the Crusades. Even after the Reformation, some reformers continued in anti-Semitism, and Hitler appealed to the writings of Martin Luther to justify his actions. In the 11th century, the Jews didn't die off during the plagues due to their superior hygiene, and so they were accused of poisoning the wells and were expelled from England in 1290. They were not let back in until Oliver Cromwell invited them back in 1648. And so the image of Shylock in The Merchant of Venice is a total fabrication, since Shakespeare could never have met a Jew. The site of Clifford's Tower, the keep of York's medieval castle, still bears witness to the most horrifying event in the history of English Jewry. On the night of 16th of March 1190, the feast of Shabbat ha-Gadol, the small Jewish community of York was gathered together for protection inside the tower. Rather than perish at the hands of the violent mob that awaited them outside, many of the Jews took their own lives. Others died in the flames they had lit, and those who finally surrendered were massacred and murdered. As Christians, we owe a debt to the Jews. It's from them that salvation has come. We accept everything that the Jews heard from God in the Scriptures. Our festivals are Christian versions of Jewish festivals. Easter is Passover, Whitsun is Pentecost, Christmas is the Feast of Tabernacles, or would be if it was in September. Restitution and repentance are needed to bring us back together. And as a result of this, we should accept and support. Should we accept and support everything the State of Israel does? Well, the answer to that is no. We must always stand on the side of righteousness and justice. Should we support the peace process? And this brings in the question of whether Israel has the right to give away land God has restored to them. And there are no simple answers to this. We must recognise the right of Israel to exist and to defend itself. We must not see Palestinians just as terrorists, but as people for whom Jesus died, and seek to reach out to them too. We should pray for the peace of Jerusalem, because that's what we're instructed to do in Psalm 122 verse 6, and because it's an environment of peace, it's in that environment that the gospel prospers. Eschatologically, we look forward to the restoration of Israel to the Lord, just as he has restored them to the land. And in Romans 11:26, we are promised that all Israel will be saved, when according to Zechariah 12:10, they look upon him whom they've pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son. In the meantime, we're called to preach the gospel, uphold justice, and await his coming. I hope you found that helpful. If you have any questions, please let me know. If you disagree, that's also fine, but I give that to you for your consideration. Thank you.